I walked into the room and froze. The words hit me like a slap I hadn't seen coming. Finally, we're splitting Mom's $8 million. My knees almost gave out beneath me, and the room spun just slightly, the chandelier's crystals catching the sunlight in sharp, cruel flashes. My son, my own flesh and blood, was smiling like he'd won some private lottery, and for a moment, I felt nothing but the weight of betrayal press into my chest. I should have left. I should have turned around. But I didn't. I stood there, my hand trembling on the edge of the polished oak table, hearing the faint rustle of papers and the subtle whisper of the attorney's voice somewhere behind me. My name is Marjorie Clark. I am 72 years old, a woman who has seen enough winters to know the quiet ache of loss, yet still hold on to the fragile bloom of hope. I grew up in a small town in Vermont, where the air always smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. I spent decades teaching literature to children who didn't yet know the weight of words, and I raised 2 children with as much love and patience as my sometimes weary heart could manage. Life had been long, often gentle, sometimes cruel, but mostly full of ordinary joys. The smell of baking bread on Sunday mornings, the worn pages of favorite novels, the golden sunlight spilling across my garden. I'd never imagined that one day my own son, the boy I had once rocked to sleep in a pale blue blanket, would look at me with that kind of greed, that gleaming satisfaction in what he considered my final downfall. But I'll admit, the first shock didn't make sense immediately. I wanted to scream, to ask what was happening, but my voice seemed to have evaporated somewhere between my throat and my lungs. The soft murmur of other family members and the attorney's careful cadence created a background hum I barely registered. And yet, as I stood there in my floral dress, the one I'd worn for my granddaughter's last recital, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I knew deep in the marrow of my bones that this was only the beginning. What I didn't yet realize was how far the betrayal stretched, how many hidden cracks there were beneath the polished surface of our family. That day, sunlight fell unevenly through the tall windows, catching dust motes like tiny stars suspended in air. I took a quiet breath. I would see this through. But first I had to remember who I was. The day of the will reading felt unervingly ordinary until it wasn't. The courtroom, or maybe it was a small conference room at the law firm, was suffused with that peculiar antiseptic smell that seems to cling to places where fortunes are divided and secrets are unearthed. Leather chairs, polished wood, faint traces of coffee and anxiety. I'd worn my lavender cardigan that morning, the one my granddaughter Lily had picked out for me because it made my gray hair glimmer softly in the sunlight. It was meant to be comforting, to remind me of gentle mornings spent with her laughter spilling over pancakes and spilled juice. From the start, I noticed the small things that should have been dismissed but lodged in my chest like splinters. My son Jeremy kept fidgeting with his cufflinks, those small silver knots I'd bought him for his 21st birthday, now seeming grotesque in their gleam. His eyes darted constantly as if mapping an invisible battlefield. My daughter Rachel sat quietly beside me, hands folded neatly, offering me a small fleeting smile every now and then. She knew, though neither of us dared say it aloud yet, that the tension was more than ordinary. The attorney began with the usual formalities, his voice smooth, deliberate, carrying the weight of paper, law, and years of procedural practice. I tried to focus, nodding at the right moments, murmuring polite responses, but my mind kept circling back to Jeremy's expression, too sharp, too eager, too satisfied in a way that felt like betrayal in slow motion. When he made his first comment, it was casual, almost offhand. "I guess all this is finally mine, huh?" My stomach lurched. It wasn't the words themselves, though they were cutting, it was the certainty behind them, the unspoken assumption that I was nothing more than a stepping stone to his gain. I remember trying to mask my reaction, pressing my lips together, feeling the familiar tremor of anger that rose when someone I love and trust dares to disregard the very essence of my life. But I didn't act on it. I've learned over decades that anger is like fire in the wind, dangerous, wild, and often uncontrollable. Instead, I let the quiet seep into me, a slow, measured response. I could feel the pulse in my wrists, the subtle ache behind my eyes, the tiny tremor of my hands as I adjusted the shawl over my shoulders. Each sensation reminded me that I was here, that I was alive, and that even if Jeremy didn't see me as more than a ledger entry, I was still my own person. As the attorney read through the pages of the will, the cracks began to reveal themselves. Small omissions, odd phrasings, strange allocations that didn't match the conversations I'd had with my late husband Thomas before his passing. I felt a chill creep up my spine, the kind that whispers that everything is not as it seems. I tried to remind myself to stay calm, to trust the process, but every fiber of my being, years of intuition, experience, and quiet observation, was shouting that something had shifted beneath the surface of my family. Jeremy continued his subtle maneuvers, leaning slightly toward his sister when he thought no one was watching, lowering his voice as if sharing conspiratorial jokes I wasn't meant to hear. Rachel's hands tightened around mine once, a small signal, a silent plea for patience. I realized that what I had initially dismissed as excitement or nervousness was, in fact, a careful performance. He had been waiting for this moment, rehearsing it for months, maybe even years, and now the stage was set. By mid-morning, the tension had thickened into a tangible fog. I felt the room shrink around me, the polished surfaces reflecting not just light but a creeping sense of isolation. The air seemed heavy, almost viscous, each breath a small effort. I tried to ground myself in memory, the smell of Thomas's old study, the warmth of Lily's tiny hands in mine, the soft clink of teacups on saucers in my sunlit kitchen. Those memories were my anchors, tiny lifeboats in the swelling tide of betrayal. It wasn't until the attorney paused to shuffle some papers that the first real warning sign struck. Jeremy leaned forward, his eyes flicking to the corner of the table where the original estate documents were stacked, and whispered something too quiet for anyone else to catch. Rachel stiffened, her jaw tightening, and I realized in that instant that this wasn't just greed, it was a plan. A carefully executed, insidious plan that had been brewing silently, just beneath the surface of ordinary family life. I could almost see it unfold like a shadow play. Late-night calls, hushed meetings, small manipulations that left me questioning my own perceptions. Every time I recalled a disagreement with Jeremy, a forgotten promise, a subtle slight, the pieces began to align. The betrayal wasn't abrupt, it had been patient, slow, insidious. The house, once a sanctuary filled with the smell of bread and books, felt like a stage, and I had been performing, oblivious, while the true drama was plotted in whispers and ledger entries. And yet, despite the shock, the fear, the initial sting of anger, I found an unexpected clarity. I realized that my position was not entirely helpless. My mind, still sharp despite the decades, began cataloging, observing, calculating. I noticed the small gestures, the micro-expressions, the inconsistencies that others would overlook. My heart ached, yes, but it also hardened in resolve. I had spent a lifetime teaching children to see, to read between lines, to notice the invisible currents that guide human behavior. Now that skill was mine again, and this time it was for me. By the end of that day, I understood that betrayal was not a single act, but a series of moments, subtle and deliberate. And I also understood that I had a choice: to crumble quietly under the weight of deception, or to rise quietly, deliberately, and reclaim not just my wealth but my dignity, my voice, and my life. As we left the room, sunlight pouring unevenly across the marble floor, I felt a strange mixture of grief and determination. Jeremy's smile lingered in my mind, a sharpened edge against my own resolve. But I had a plan, even if I didn't yet know all the pieces. I had survived 72 years, and I was not about to surrender my life to blind greed. I had been hurt, but I was far from finished. After that day, the house felt different. Not outwardly, on the surface, everything was as it had always been, but underneath, the walls seemed colder, the air heavier. I wandered from room to room, tracing my fingers along the familiar grooves of the oak banister, the polished surfaces of my kitchen counters, and even the faded quilt I had stitched by hand. Everything was familiar yet alien. I could almost hear the echo of Jeremy's words in the empty hallways, bouncing off walls, settling like dust in corners I had long thought safe. I started sleeping in fits, waking to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant, muffled sound of traffic on the street below. Shadows seemed to stretch longer in the dim light, and every creak of the floorboards made me flinch. It was as if the house itself had turned its back on me. I tried to tell myself that fear was irrational, that Jeremy was still my son, that the world hadn't truly changed. But each time I opened the mailbox or checked the bank statements, small, gnawing doubts crept in. There were emails I hadn't written, documents I hadn't signed, mentions of meetings I'd never attended, all carefully orchestrated to make me question my own memory, my own perception. The betrayal was subtle, patient. Jeremy didn't yell, didn't openly declare his intentions. He smiled, nodded, acted concerned, but there was an undercurrent of calculation beneath the warmth. It was as if I were standing in the middle of a familiar room while someone rearranged the furniture behind my back, step by step. And I began to notice other small things, signs I had once dismissed. Missed calls from family friends, vague excuses for unexpected delays, hints of secrets tucked in the edges of conversations. I realized that the world I thought I knew, the life I had carefully built over decades, was quietly shifting beneath me. I remember one particular morning vividly. I had made my usual cup of tea, the steam rising in soft spirals, carrying with it the faint scent of chamomile and honey. Lily, my granddaughter, had been over the night before, leaving behind traces of her presence. The small sock she'd lost under the sofa, a bookmark she'd left in the poetry book I had read to her. I sat in my favorite armchair, staring at the window, and felt a crushing loneliness. The silence of the house pressed into me, amplifying the absence of trust one had once taken for granted. I was no longer the center of my own home. I felt like an intruder in the life I had lived for 72 years. Even my body seemed to betray me. I felt a tightness in my chest, a fatigue that sleep did not cure, and a dull, persistent ache in my joints. It wasn't just grief. It was the physical weight of being unseen, unvalued, slowly erased. I became hyper-aware of the ways in which my presence could be minimized. Emails that went unanswered, casual dismissals in conversations, small gestures of impatience from those I had loved. It felt like I was shrinking in real time, fading into a corner of my own life, while the very people who owed me everything smiled in my face and plotted their gain. I tried to reach out, to talk, to confront, but even the act of speaking became fraught. My voice, once confident and assured, trembled when I tried to articulate the unease I felt. Friends, distant relatives, even Rachel, though she remained my quiet ally, seemed caught in their own webs of uncertainty. I realized, painfully, that I could not rely on anyone else to validate my experience. The isolation was complete, and in that isolation I had to confront the raw truth. I had been betrayed, and it had been deliberate. And yet, even in the deepest moments of fear and sadness, small sparks of clarity began to flicker. I remembered my mornings teaching literature, guiding children through the subtleties of human nature, the hidden motives, the whispers beneath dialogue. That same awareness now applied to my own family, to Jeremy, to the patterns I had long ignored. The first step toward reclaiming myself, I realized, was simply seeing clearly, without flinching, without excuse. During those early weeks of quiet suffering, Lily became my tether to hope. She didn't fully understand the intricacies of adult deceit, nor did she need to. She only needed to be present, to offer a hand, a soft word, a shared laugh over a silly story. Her presence reminded me that life could still be tender, that joy was not entirely stolen from me. In her eyes, I found a reflection of the woman I had once been, strong, observant, full of quiet determination. I began writing again, first small notes in a notebook, then longer reflections, cataloging events, inconsistencies, and emotions. It became my lifeline, my subtle reclamation of voice. Each entry was a thread weaving me back into myself, binding me to the woman I had been before the betrayal, before the creeping sense of invisibility. Slowly, meticulously, I began to remember that pain, while real, was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a chapter one would write for myself. And so, I sat in that quiet, sunlit room, pen in hand, heart aching yet aware, feeling the first stirrings of resolve. I would not let this betrayal define the final chapters of my life. Jeremy might believe he had stripped me of power, of dignity, of presence, but he had underestimated something elemental. I had survived loss before, I had navigated deception before, and I had an unshakable awareness of the truth. I closed the notebook with a small, deliberate snap. The house remained silent, the shadows long across the floor, yet for the first time since the will reading, I felt a subtle pulse of life within me. I was still here. I was still me. And soon, the quiet strength I had long cultivated would guide me to reclaim not only my place in my family but the very essence of my selfhood that Jeremy had tried to diminish. Pain was my companion now, but so was determination. The first glimmer of clarity came one rainy afternoon. I had been sitting by the window, watching the gray skies drizzle against the garden, the faint smell of wet earth drifting in. The world outside moved in gentle rhythms, the swish of cars along the street, the distant barking of a dog, but inside my mind was anything but calm. I began retracing events in my head, cataloging every interaction, every small inconsistency, every subtle slight Jeremy had made. At first it felt obsessive, unhealthy even, but gradually it became methodical, deliberate. I started noticing patterns I had once dismissed as coincidence. Phone calls that arrived just after I had left the room, documents subtly altered without my knowledge, hushed conversations that abruptly ended when I entered. Jeremy's schedule seemed too precise, too calculated. Even his casual smiles and gestures now appeared choreographed, each movement designed to convey loyalty while quietly undermining me. The realization was both painful and empowering. The betrayal had not been accidental. It was intentional, patient, cunning, and I could anticipate it. I began to act with quiet stealth. First, I observed, recording details in my notebook. Times, dates, reactions. Then I revisited old letters and emails, comparing handwriting, checking for small discrepancies, tracing transactions that seemed oddly timed or unnecessary. The process was slow, meticulous, almost meditative, and it brought a strange sense of control back into my life. For the first time since the will reading, I felt a flicker of agency. I was not powerless. I was learning the contours of the battlefield without revealing my hand. Rachel became my silent ally. She didn't ask questions, didn't voice suspicions publicly, but her presence during phone calls and casual interactions with Jeremy gave me subtle confirmation that I was not imagining things. We communicated in glances, in small, coded gestures. The arch of an eyebrow, a hand on a chair, a slightly prolonged pause. In those quiet exchanges, I felt the strength of solidarity, and it reminded me that I was not entirely alone in the world. I also began paying attention to Jeremy's financial behavior, not in a frantic or desperate way, but with the patience of someone tracking a river's current. Every transfer, every unexpected purchase, every casual boast about investments or property caught my attention. Slowly, the picture began to emerge. A web of ambition, manipulation, and a greed that was almost architectural in its design. It wasn't just about money, it was about control, about shaping the narrative of my life without my consent. One evening, as I sat with my notebook and a cup of chamomile tea, Lily came into the room carrying a small stack of her artwork. Her laughter, bright and unburdened, was a balm to my frayed nerves. I watched her carefully, noting how her presence could ground me in reality when the shadows of betrayal seemed overwhelming. She reminded me of the softer parts of life, the parts worth defending, the parts worth reclaiming. In that moment, I realized that my fight was not only for myself but for the legacy I wanted to leave for her, the lessons of strength, observation, and integrity. The next step was subtle probing. I asked Jeremy innocuous questions, pretending ignorance while observing his responses carefully. The flicker of irritation when I pressed gently, the micro-expressions of impatience or surprise, they all spoke volumes. He believed I was unaware, that I was passive, that I could be underestimated. And he was right in a sense. I had endured the shock of his betrayal, but now, beneath the calm exterior, a quiet storm was forming. Every smile, every gesture, every casual remark he made would now be catalogued and remembered. I also revisited the legal documents, not just reading them but analyzing them with the precision of a scholar dissecting a text. Odd phrasings, ambiguous clauses, and seemingly minor omissions began to take on new meaning. I realized that the plan to diminish my control over the estate had been laid years in advance, carefully, patiently. But in understanding this, I also discovered leverage. The power of knowledge, of patience, of silent, deliberate observation. As the days passed, I began reclaiming my routines. Gardening in the early morning, long walks through the neighborhood, quiet moments with Lily reading poetry. Each act, simple as it seemed, reinforced my sense of self, reminded me that I was more than the sum of Jeremy's ambitions. And with each observation, each careful note, I felt the subtle shift of power returning to me. By the end of that week, I knew I was ready for the next phase. Not confrontation, not loud accusations, but a quiet, intelligent strategy. I would gather evidence, anticipate moves, and create a position where my voice and authority could no longer be ignored. The pain of betrayal would not disappear, but it would be transformed into clarity, into control, into power. Sitting in the soft glow of the afternoon sun, notebook open, pen in hand, I realized that I had begun to move from victim to strategist. It was a slow, careful transformation, almost imperceptible at first but inexorably real. I could feel it in the way my thoughts sharpened, in the way my observations gained depth, in the way my resolve hardened without losing its grace. Jeremy may have believed he had reduced me to a ghost in my own home. But he had underestimated 72 years of life, observation, resilience, and quiet intelligence. I was no longer just the woman who had been betrayed. I was becoming the woman who would reclaim her story, piece by piece, silently but irrevocably. And in that quiet, rainy afternoon, I finally allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The storm had not yet broken, but it would in time on my terms. It happened on a Tuesday morning, gray and overcast, the kind of day that made the house feel smaller, tighter, almost suffocating. I had risen early as usual, the faint aroma of brewed coffee curling through the kitchen. Lily had spent the night, leaving behind the soft scent of her shampoo and the warmth of her laughter lingering in the corners. It was comforting, grounding, but it also reminded me sharply of what was at stake. I had been going through old bank statements and invoices, a slow and deliberate process that had become a ritual. I moved each paper carefully, noting dates, amounts, and discrepancies, trying to find patterns in the chaos Jeremy had left behind. My hands trembled occasionally, not from weakness, but from the adrenaline of discovery. And then I saw it. A series of transfers, small at first glance, yet impossible to ignore. Each payment was directed to accounts I had never authorized, under the guise of investments, consulting fees, household expenses. My heart sank, but I didn't panic. I had learned long ago that clarity comes not from a rush of emotion, but from careful observation. The pattern became more sinister as I continued. Payments had been staggered, timed to avoid notice, each one designed to make me doubt my own awareness. Jeremy had taken months, perhaps years, to orchestrate this. Every financial decision, every casual remark, every smile I had once trusted now appeared as a calculated deception. I could almost hear him in my mind, rehearsing the casual lines, the jokes, the polite gestures that masked the undercurrent of betrayal. I felt a cold anger rise in me, not the kind that screams or throws things, but a sharp, precise anger that focused my mind like a lens. I recalled the moments I had brushed off tiny irregularities, thinking I was imagining things. Every ignored instinct, every dismissed suspicion had been Jeremy's advantage. And now the truth was undeniable. The betrayal was not just emotional, it was calculated, legal, financial. It was a plan executed with patience, with meticulous detail, and it had been right under my nose all along. That afternoon I confronted the first tangible proof. A set of documents in Jeremy's handwriting, but subtly altered, signed in my name. They were hidden in the back of a filing cabinet I rarely used, a place I trusted because I had once believed in him. Each forged signature, each altered line, was a declaration of his disregard for me, his willingness to manipulate my life for personal gain. I felt a sharp pang of hurt, a feeling I hadn't experienced in decades. It was betrayal distilled, pure and unflinching, and it hit harder than anything I had imagined. And yet, amid the pain, a strange clarity emerged. I wasn't just the victim here, I was the observer, the strategist. I could see the pattern, understand the methods, anticipate the moves. I began taking photographs of the documents, making notes in my ledger, cataloging every detail. I also reached out to trusted advisors quietly, old friends who had been loyal to me for years, to confirm my observations and provide counsel. Every step was deliberate, controlled. Every emotion measured. Even with the evidence in hand, I could feel the toll on my body and mind. Sleep came fitfully, my chest tight with anxiety, the shadows of the house seeming to whisper accusations I couldn't answer. I felt an odd sense of erasure, as if Jeremy's ambitions were not only taking my money but attempting to erase my presence entirely. I was still here, yet increasingly invisible in the very life I had built. My voice, once confident and warm, seemed muffled, lost under the weight of deceit. But I refused to succumb. I returned to my old habits, finding strength in the small rituals that had always anchored me. Early morning walks where the wind stung my cheeks, quiet afternoons with Lily drawing and reading poetry, evenings spent cataloging evidence and planning my next steps. These routines reminded me that while betrayal could wound, it could not define me. I was 72, yes, but I was also resilient, intelligent, and observant in ways Jeremy had underestimated. By midweek, I had uncovered another layer of deception. Jeremy had been manipulating not just the finances, but the narrative itself, altering memories, rewriting stories, and ensuring that those around him viewed me as passive, forgetful, or incapable. I realized the depth of his strategy. He wasn't only after the money, he was after my reputation, my dignity, my very identity. And yet, in recognizing this, I also saw the path forward. Knowledge was power, and the more I observed, documented, and understood, the stronger I became. I began speaking carefully to Rachel, sharing observations and strategies in hushed tones. We devised subtle ways to monitor Jeremy without alerting him, ensuring that each step we took was invisible, deliberate, and precise. Our communications became coded, brief glances, small signals, tiny gestures that carried massive meaning. Rachel, who had always been my quiet ally, now became my partner in reclaiming not just the estate, but the respect and authority that Jeremy sought to strip from me. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the windows, Lily brought me a cup of cocoa and asked, in her simple, innocent way, why I seemed so serious lately. I smiled at her, brushing her hair gently behind her ear, and told her simply, "Sometimes, sweetheart, we have to be careful with the people we love, to make sure they see the truth." She nodded, not fully understanding, but her presence reminded me why I was doing this. It wasn't just about money, control, or pride. It was about teaching her that strength, patience, and quiet observation are as vital as love and kindness. By the end of that week, I had collected a small arsenal of proof, emails, documents, subtle discrepancies, all quietly building a case I could present, not with anger but with precision. I realized that Jeremy's arrogance had been his greatest mistake. He believed my age, my calm demeanor, and my natural politeness would make me easy to manipulate. He had underestimated 72 years of observation, intuition, and resilience. I closed my ledger that night, the room quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional drip of rain. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the intensity of the day. I felt the mingled ache of betrayal and the surge of empowerment. I was no longer the woman caught off guard. I was the woman who could see the entire board, anticipate the moves, and act when the time was right. The storm was approaching, but this time I would meet it on my terms. The house felt heavier that morning, as though it had absorbed my anger, my fear, my determination, and held it just out of reach. The sun tried to filter through the drapes, pale and hesitant, but even its warmth seemed subdued, filtered through the tension that clung to every corner. I knew Jeremy would be home soon. He always returned by mid-morning, casual, confident, smug in the belief that I was unaware of the depth of his plans. But today I would not be passive. I spent the early hours reviewing my notes, each discrepancy, each small act of deceit meticulously catalogued. My hands moved with precision, writing details, highlighting transactions, noting dates and times, connecting the dots. I was methodical, almost clinical. I had learned through decades of life and teaching that patience and observation could reveal truths that emotion alone could not. Jeremy had assumed I would be too shocked, too vulnerable, too polite to act. He had underestimated my experience, my mind, and my quiet resolve. When he walked in, the faint scent of his cologne preceded him, a blend of citrus and musk intended, I imagined, to impress and distract. He greeted me with a smile, perfectly rehearsed, and a casual, "Morning, Mom. Did you sleep well?" His tone carried ease, but beneath it, I detected the usual undertone, the arrogance of someone who believed he had won before the game had even begun. I nodded politely, smiling gently, hiding the storm that simmered just beneath the surface. As he moved toward the kitchen, I noticed the small gestures, the subtle tightening of his jaw when he thought I wasn't looking, the careful way he arranged the mail, the way his eyes flicked toward my notebook with a hint of calculation. He believed I was oblivious, that I was still reeling from the betrayal. And in a sense he was right. I had felt the weight of it. But I was no longer paralyzed by shock. I had begun to anticipate, to plan, to act quietly, deliberately, like a chess player positioning pieces before the first decisive move. I let the conversation drift lightly, talking about trivial things. The weather, Lily's latest school project, my plans to reorganize the garden. All the while I watched, noted, and catalogued. Jeremy responded with practiced nonchalance, sprinkling in small remarks meant to appear innocent but layered with subtle manipulation, comments about finances, questions about my attention to detail, offhand mentions of documents he assumed I hadn't reviewed. but I had reviewed them. Every word, every line, every subtle alteration had been noted. By mid-morning, I decided it was time to test him carefully. I asked about a minor investment he had claimed to manage, one I knew was documented in my ledger as non-existent. "Jeremy, I noticed the Smith account hasn't been touched in months. Did you adjust it, or was that another oversight?" I kept my voice calm, casual, almost conversational. His reaction was immediate, though subtle, a flicker of surprise, the faintest stiffening of his posture, a micro-expression he must have thought I wouldn't notice. But I did notice. Every hesitation, every slight misstep, became part of my growing map of his deception. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse. I simply observed. Then, as if compelled by his own arrogance, Jeremy began to reveal more. Small confessions disguised as explanations. "Oh, I just handled it temporarily, Mom. I thought it would be easier that way." He smiled, a slight smirk that he believed conveyed competence and care. I nodded politely, making mental notes. Temporary. Easier. Every word a clue, every gesture a roadmap to the truth. I spent the afternoon quietly gathering documents, photographs, and corroborating evidence. I contacted old friends and trusted advisors under the guise of casual inquiries, each conversation coded, careful, deliberate. Each piece added to the growing tapestry of understanding. I wasn't just piecing together financial misdeeds, I was mapping intent, character, patterns of manipulation, and hubris. Jeremy's confidence, his arrogance, his belief that I was passive, all of it became evidence of his own undoing. That evening, Lily came in with her homework, plopping down next to me with a sigh of frustration over math problems she didn't yet understand. Her presence was grounding, a reminder of why this mattered beyond money or pride. I helped her work through the problems, guiding her patiently, explaining, encouraging. In those moments, I felt a quiet surge of purpose. I was not alone. I had allies, both young and old. And I was reclaiming not just my life but the lessons I wanted to pass down. Strength, patience, observation, and dignity. Later, as the house settled into the soft hum of evening, I reflected on the day. Jeremy had revealed cracks in his own carefully constructed facade, unknowingly giving me the tools I needed. I had observed without anger, catalogued without haste, and now I had clarity. I understood the depth of his deception, the extent of his ambition, and the arrogance that had led him to believe he could outmaneuver me. I poured a cup of chamomile tea, the steam rising gently in the dim light. The soft scent reminded me of mornings long past, of breakfasts with Thomas, of quiet afternoons reading to my children, of Lily's laughter echoing through sunlit rooms. Pain still lingered, the ache of betrayal, the sting of loneliness, the fear of being erased. But now it was tempered with purpose, with strategy, with a patient, deliberate calm. I was no longer reacting, I was planning. That night I began outlining the steps I would take. Not loud confrontations, not rash accusations, but quiet, deliberate moves that would ensure truth and justice were undeniable. I would leverage the evidence, anticipate the next manipulations, and position myself where my authority could not be ignored. I would reclaim not just my estate but my voice, my dignity, and my presence. As I drifted to sleep, the house silent except for the soft tick of the clock, I felt the first stirrings of a profound calm. The storm had not yet broken, but I would meet it, not with rage but with quiet, unshakable strength. I had been betrayed, yes, but I had also awakened to my own power. And soon, Jeremy would see that the woman he underestimated was far more formidable than he had ever imagined. The morning sunlight spilled across the kitchen table, soft and golden, yet it could not warm the chill that had settled in my chest. I had spent hours the night before combing through ledgers, invoices, and bank statements, cross-referencing every detail, every transaction Jeremy had manipulated. What I uncovered that morning made my hands shake, not with fear, but with a combination of anger and a growing, unshakable determination. The web of deceit was far deeper than I had imagined. Jeremy had not only siphoned funds from my accounts. He had created phantom investments, falsified documents, and manipulated legal instruments to give the appearance of legitimacy. Every document he touched carried a faint signature of his arrogance, a tiny clue that screamed in silence, waiting for me to notice. And notice I did. I carefully photographed each piece, annotated every line, and cross-referenced with trusted records I had maintained for decades. The pattern was deliberate, calculated, and thorough. He had orchestrated a narrative designed to make me seem forgetful, passive, even incapable of understanding the very life I had built. I felt a wave of betrayal unlike any I had experienced before. But amid the ache and the disbelief, a spark of clarity ignited. This was not just theft, it was hubris. Jeremy had assumed that my age, my quiet demeanor, my kindness, would make me pliable. He had underestimated the patience, observation, and intelligence that 72 years of life had cultivated in me. Every act of deception, every forged signature, every casual lie became a tool for me now, a map of his miscalculations and overconfidence. I spent the afternoon reaching out to trusted professionals quietly, attorneys, accountants, and friends who had helped me navigate small challenges over the years. I framed my inquiries innocuously, careful not to reveal the depth of my knowledge yet. Each conversation provided subtle confirmations, small validations of what I already suspected. The betrayal was absolute, but so was my growing ability to respond with deliberate precision. That evening, Rachel joined me in the library, her presence a comforting anchor. She had always been perceptive, more cautious than Jeremy, more patient than most. We sat together, our heads bent over documents, whispering quietly. Every discovery I shared was met with a measured response, a suggestion, a careful observation. Together we traced every misstep, every hidden transfer, every falsified record. It became clear that Jeremy had overreached, weaving a web so intricate that it could collapse under the weight of its own complexity. Even in the midst of this revelation, the emotional toll was heavy. I felt the sharp sting of loneliness, the ache of betrayal by someone I had loved without hesitation. Nights were restless. Shadows in the corners of the house seemed to watch, almost taunt, the way betrayal does when it lingers in familiar spaces. I worried fleetingly that my body might betray me under the stress, the tightness in my chest, the occasional tremor in my hands, but each time I reminded myself that resilience is built in moments like this. Pain can sharpen focus as effectively as it can dull it. Lily continued to be my emotional anchor. She didn't need the details of the deceit. She only needed my presence, my attention, my reassurance. Her laughter, her innocent questions about school or art, reminded me that life had tender, beautiful threads worth protecting. She anchored me to what mattered beyond wealth, beyond betrayal. I began to see that my fight was not just about reclaiming money or authority, it was about integrity, dignity, and the lessons I would leave for the next generation. By midweek I had begun formulating a plan. Jeremy had relied on subtle manipulation, legal ambiguity, and my presumed inattention. I would counter with patience, evidence, and careful timing. I started organizing the documents, emails, and photographs into a clear narrative, a quiet, undeniable case that would expose the deception without hysteria or overt confrontation. I needed to ensure that every detail, every discrepancy, every falsification could be proven, documented, and presented in a way that left no room for manipulation. The first concrete step came when I quietly secured digital backups of every document. Each photograph, each scanned page, each email thread was copied, encrypted, and stored safely. I wanted redundancy, certainty, and the knowledge that Jeremy's next move could not erase the evidence. In doing so, I felt a subtle shift of power, the kind of power that comes not from intimidation or loud confrontation, but from quiet preparation, patience, and strategy. I also began to observe Jeremy with greater subtlety, noting his habits, his mannerisms, and his patterns. He had become complacent, believing his deception was invisible. He underestimated the resolve of the woman he had tried to erase. Each careless remark, each fleeting expression, each attempt to manipulate a conversation became fuel for the plan I was quietly assembling. He thought he had reduced me to a shadow. In reality, I had become a strategist, a silent observer, a patient architect of justice. One evening, as rain fell softly against the windows, I closed my ledger and leaned back in my chair, reflecting on the journey from shock to clarity. The pain of betrayal was still sharp, the ache in my chest persistent, but it had transformed. What had begun as fear, loneliness, and heartbreak was now tempered by purpose, awareness, and quiet power. I realized that the ultimate reclamation would not be loud, not dramatic, not vengeful. It would be precise, deliberate, and undeniable. That night, I whispered to Lily as she drifted to sleep, Sometimes the quietest voice carries the most strength. She smiled in her sleep, a small, innocent expression, and I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. I was not only reclaiming my life but also preserving a legacy of patience, dignity, and wisdom. By the end of Part 7, I had transformed from a woman stunned by betrayal into one who saw clearly, planned meticulously, and understood that true power is often quiet. The evidence was gathered, the strategy forming, and the first steps toward justice, measured, calm, deliberate, were already in motion. Jeremy's arrogance had blinded him. My patience and clarity would be my greatest advantage. I closed the windows that night. The rain softened to a gentle drizzle, and allowed myself a small, resolute smile. The storm had been mapped and I was ready to navigate it on my terms. The mornings had begun to take on a new rhythm. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and earth as I walked through the garden before the sun fully rose. Each step was deliberate, each breath steady, as if the world itself had slowed down to accommodate the quiet determination growing within me. The house no longer felt like a prison. It had become my observation post, my headquarters, my sanctuary of planning. I moved through its rooms with purpose, cataloging, noting, observing, every sound and shadow recorded in the back of my mind. I started by consolidating all the evidence I had gathered. Photographs of falsified documents, scanned invoices, emails, financial statements, and even small notes from conversations that revealed Jeremy's manipulations. I organized them meticulously, creating a coherent narrative that could not be disputed. It was methodical work, and as I stacked the papers and labeled files, I felt a sense of quiet power return. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the foundation of the reclamation of my life. Rachel became an indispensable partner in this quiet campaign. She was careful, discreet, and immensely loyal. We worked together in whispered conferences, sharing observations and piecing together the full scope of Jeremy's scheme. She became my eyes in moments when I could not be present, subtly gathering information about his patterns, his interactions with others, and the casual arrogance that made him so dangerously confident. Our alliance was silent but unbreakable, a shield of trust and understanding against his web of deception. At the same time, I began reconnecting with other allies, old friends, trusted advisors, even distant relatives who had always respected my judgment. I framed each inquiry casually, under the guise of seeking advice or discussing mundane matters, but each conversation added depth and confirmation to the growing picture of Jeremy's overreach. I felt the thrill of strategy, not the reckless excitement of confrontation, but the measured, deliberate satisfaction of knowing that I was regaining control without anyone noticing. Lily continued to anchor me to hope and humanity. Her presence reminded me that this was not simply a battle over money. It was about protecting what was precious and teaching her the lessons of resilience, observation, and quiet strength. We spent afternoons drawing, reading, and sharing tea while I subtly guided her toward understanding that strength often manifests not in noise or aggression, but in patience and discernment. Every laugh, every small smile, every innocent question she asked fortified my resolve. I also began testing boundaries with Jeremy in subtle, deliberate ways. I asked innocuous questions about financial decisions, carefully noting his reactions, microexpressions, and slips of honesty. Each small mistake he made was catalogued, a thread leading deeper into the truth. He believed his confidence and charm would shield him. He assumed I was distracted, that I was weakened by age, by emotion, by previous shock. But he had underestimated the depth of my awareness and the patience I had cultivated over decades. One evening I orchestrated a small test. I casually mentioned a minor discrepancy I had noticed, watching him react. His composure wavered just slightly, a flash of irritation, a subtle tightening of his jaw, a flicker of panic in his eyes. He thought he had hidden everything, he thought he could manipulate every outcome. And yet, in that small moment, I felt the shift of power tip ever so slightly in my favor. I had begun to control the narrative, quietly and intelligently, while he remained unaware of the true extent of my awareness. The process was painstaking. Every day involved careful observation, gathering evidence, and reinforcing alliances. I cultivated my strength quietly, returning to routines that reinforced my clarity and focus. Early walks, quiet afternoons in the library, and evenings spent reviewing documents. Each action grounded me, sharpened my mind, and reminded me that patience was a weapon as formidable as anger. By the end of the week, I had established a framework for my next moves. I would not rush, I would not confront recklessly. Instead, I would wait for the perfect moment to reveal what I had uncovered. I would leverage evidence, timing, and the network of allies I had quietly built. I was no longer simply reacting. I was orchestrating, preparing, and positioning myself for a confrontation that would leave no room for deception. And yet, amid all this planning, I allowed moments of tenderness. Lily's laughter, Rachel's quiet support, and the soft hum of the house became reminders that strength is not merely about retribution, it is about reclaiming one's life, dignity, and voice. I was rebuilding, piece by piece, silently but with certainty. The storm that had been Jeremy's confidence was approaching, but I was ready to meet it, not with fury but with calm, deliberate power. By the time evening settled, painting the rooms in amber light, I felt a profound sense of clarity. Jeremy's arrogance had been his greatest mistake. He had believed that I was passive, compliant, and fragile. He had assumed that 72 years of life had left me vulnerable to manipulation. But he had underestimated the patience, intelligence, and quiet resilience that had been honed over decades of living, teaching, and surviving. I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea, the steam curling like gentle clouds above the cup, and reflected on the journey from shock to strategy. I realized that true power is often invisible, quiet, and deliberate. It does not need to shout to be heard. It does not need to rage to be felt. It moves slowly, strategically, and inevitably. And I had found it. That night, as Lily slept nearby, I whispered softly, almost to myself, "The storm is coming, but I will meet it with patience and strength." The house was quiet, yet the energy within it had shifted. I was no longer simply a victim of betrayal. I was the architect of my own reclamation, quietly, deliberately, inexorably. The house was quieter than usual that morning, but I could feel the tension in the air, a taut thread stretching across rooms and hallways. Jeremy was upstairs, probably reviewing emails, perhaps even plotting his next move, entirely unaware that the tide was beginning to turn. I moved deliberately through the kitchen, the scent of brewed coffee mingling with the faint aroma of old books and polished wood. Each sound, the creak of the floorboard, the hum of the refrigerator, felt amplified as if the house itself were alert, aware of the subtle shifts in power. I began with small, deliberate actions designed to test boundaries and observe reactions. A casually placed document on the kitchen table, highlighted with a minor discrepancy, was enough to catch Jeremy's attention when he descended for breakfast. I watched him from the corner of my eye, noting the slight stiffening of his posture, the flicker of unease in his expression, the way his hands tightened around the mug. He believed I was unaware, that I was distracted, that I remained vulnerable. In truth, every subtle gesture, every micro-expression, every attempt at manipulation was catalogued, stored, and analyzed. Breakfast was a carefully orchestrated performance. I spoke lightly, asking questions about finances, investments, and recent meetings, keeping my tone casual, almost conversational. But beneath the surface, every word was designed to probe, to observe, to measure. Jeremy responded with practiced ease, but I could see the cracks, the almost imperceptible pauses, the way his gaze shifted, the tension in his jaw. It was exhilarating in a quiet, measured way. The realization that I had regained agency, that I could control the flow of information, that I could guide the narrative without revealing the depth of my knowledge. By mid-morning, I had moved on to more deliberate strategic steps. I contacted a trusted attorney under the guise of routine consultation, subtly confirming the legal discrepancies I had discovered. Each phone call, each email, each casual inquiry reinforced my position, quietly building a foundation of undeniable evidence. Jeremy, of course, remained unaware. He believed his plans were invisible, his manipulations undetected. And yet, with each discreet action, I was consolidating power, preparing for the moment when clarity would no longer be ignored. Lily's presence became increasingly vital. She brought light into the tension, moments of softness that reminded me of the stakes beyond money or control. Her laughter, her simple questions about school, her casual, innocent commentary on our daily life, all of it grounded me, anchored me, reminded me that my fight was not only for justice but for the preservation of dignity, love, and legacy. I shared small lessons with her without explaining the full gravity of the situation. Patience, observation, and the quiet strength required to navigate a world where intentions are not always as they appear. By early afternoon, I had arranged a subtle confrontation, one designed not to provoke anger but to test Jeremy's boundaries, gauge his reactions and assert quiet authority. I placed a stack of documents in the living room where he would inevitably notice them, carefully labeled and annotated. Then I casually mentioned a minor inconsistency, phrasing it as a gentle question. "Jeremy, I noticed this transfer seems different from the others. Did you make a change or am I misunderstanding?" His reaction was immediate, though restrained. A flicker of surprise, a subtle tightening of his shoulders, the briefest hesitation in speech. He tried to mask it with humor, a casual deflection, but I had already seen the truth. Every micro-expression, every slight pause, every overcompensated smile was a confirmation of the deception I had catalogued, documented, and understood. For the first time, Jeremy was confronted with the awareness that I was not only awake to his schemes but actively navigating them with intelligence and precision. I spent the late afternoon reviewing additional evidence, cross-referencing emails, invoices, and bank statements. Each piece fit into the growing tapestry of understanding, revealing the depth of Jeremy's manipulation and the arrogance that had allowed him to believe he could deceive me without consequence. The more I uncovered, the clearer my path became. A series of subtle, strategic moves designed to reclaim authority, assert presence, and ultimately reveal the truth with undeniable force. By evening, I had coordinated quietly with Rachel, who had been my steady ally throughout this process. Together, we reviewed the catalogued evidence, discussed subtle approaches, and planned the next steps. It was not about confrontation through volume or fury, it was about precision, timing, and inevitability. Jeremy's arrogance, his overconfidence, and his belief in my passivity had become tools in my hands, guiding each calculated step toward eventual resolution. Later, as I sat with a cup of chamomile tea, the house bathed in the soft amber glow of the setting sun, I reflected on the day's progress. Pain and betrayal still lingered, a dull ache beneath the surface, but it was tempered by empowerment, clarity, and quiet purpose. I realized that the first confrontation, the subtle assertion of awareness, had shifted the dynamic. Jeremy would no longer take my presence or perception for granted. He would begin to sense that the woman he had sought to manipulate was no longer passive, no longer naive, no longer invisible. I allowed myself a small, deliberate smile, not of triumph but of affirmation. The storm was approaching, but I was ready. I had patience, clarity, and strategy. I had allies, evidence, and observation. I had Lily, Rachel, and my own resilience, all serving as reminders that the battle was not only about reclaiming power but about preserving integrity, dignity, and legacy. That night, as Lily drifted to sleep beside me, I whispered softly, "We are stronger than the shadows around us." And I meant it not just for her but for myself. The quiet reclamation of control had begun, the subtle shifts in power were already taking shape, and the first strategic victories had been claimed without raising a voice or striking a blow. The following days were a blur of quiet calculation. Every morning, I moved through the house with deliberate precision, checking the details I had catalogued, ensuring that nothing had been overlooked. The documents, emails, and photographs that had once been overwhelming now formed a clear, coherent map of Jeremy's manipulations. I traced every line of deceit, every small act of overreach, and realized that his arrogance had left a trail too blatant for even the most cautious observer to ignore. I began coordinating more formally with Rachel, refining our plan. We discussed strategy late into the night, reviewing evidence and rehearsing potential scenarios. Each move had to be precise, intentional, and subtle. Jeremy still believed he had the upper hand, that his confidence, charm, and careful deception made him untouchable. And yet, in every meeting, every casual conversation, he revealed pieces of the puzzle, flaws in his story, slight hesitations, micro-expressions of guilt that he thought were invisible. I started to reclaim my space in the house, not just physically but psychologically. Where Jeremy had tried to dominate, I now asserted calm authority. I began scheduling my own appointments with attorneys, arranging my financial affairs with precision, and even taking steps to secure assets independently. Nothing overt, nothing confrontational, just quiet moves that re-established boundaries, ensured oversight, and made it impossible for him to manipulate without exposure. One afternoon, I discovered a small discrepancy in a property transfer. A line in a legal document had been subtly altered to grant temporary authority to Jeremy without my knowledge. It was a minor detail in the larger picture, but it was the perfect lever. I photographed it, cross-referenced with other records, and shared it discreetly with my attorney. In that moment, I realized the significance. Jeremy had left himself an opening, and I had the patience, knowledge, and calm to exploit it. At the same time, I continued to strengthen my emotional base. Lily became both anchor and inspiration. Her laughter, her curiosity, and her trust reminded me that my fight was not only for myself but for the lessons I would leave behind. Patience, integrity, and the quiet, unstoppable force of resilience. We spent afternoons together in the garden, tending flowers and sharing small, tender moments, each one reinforcing the human reason for reclaiming control. Jeremy, meanwhile, remained unaware of the storm gathering quietly around him. He continued his casual attempts at dominance, assuming my composure was weakness, my patience ignorance. Each time he tried to manipulate or control, I responded with measured calm, subtle redirection, or careful questioning that exposed the cracks in his facade. It was exhilarating, not in a loud, triumphant way, but in the precise, intellectual satisfaction of knowing that the truth was mine to wield. By midweek, I had accumulated not just documentation but undeniable leverage. I had identified falsified signatures, unauthorized transfers, and repeated attempts to manipulate accounts and narratives. Each piece of evidence was a thread, and together they formed a net that Jeremy could not escape. The confidence I felt was quiet, measured, and deliberate. I no longer feared confrontation. I understood it would be necessary, and I would meet it on my terms. I also began to subtly involve external witnesses, trusted individuals who could corroborate my observations. Friends, former colleagues, and advisors, all discreetly consulted, formed a quiet network of validation. Jeremy had believed he could manipulate perception, that those around him would see me as forgetful or passive. But by quietly gathering support, I ensured that the truth was visible to those who mattered, even if Jeremy remained unaware of its inevitability. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the living room in amber light, I reviewed the evidence and planned the next steps. Every action had to be intentional, every confrontation calibrated. I did not need drama or shouting. I needed precision, patience, and inevitability. Jeremy's overconfidence had been his greatest flaw. He had assumed that 72 years of life, observation, and intelligence would not be applied in deliberate strategy. He was wrong. As the house settled into the quiet hum of evening, I felt a profound sense of readiness. The storm was imminent, but I was prepared. I had patience, clarity, and leverage. I had allies, documentation, and the moral certainty that comes from truth. Most importantly, I had Lily, whose presence reminded me why this mattered beyond ego or wealth. For legacy, for integrity, for the quiet but unassailable strength of a life fully lived. That night, I whispered softly to her as she drifted off to sleep. The storm is coming, but it will meet patience, truth, and strength. And I meant it not only for her but for myself. I was no longer simply a woman betrayed. I was a strategist, a quiet force, a presence whose patience and precision would leave the deception exposed, undeniable, and irreversible. The morning of the confrontation arrived quietly, without warning, yet every detail had been anticipated, every step planned. The sun filtered through the drapes in pale, determined beams, casting long, deliberate shadows across the polished wood floors. The house seemed to hold its breath, aware of the tension that had settled over every room. I moved through the kitchen with calm precision, the scent of brewed coffee mingling with faint notes of autumn leaves that had drifted in through the open window. Jeremy was already in the living room, casually reviewing a stack of documents he believed were safe in his control. He looked up at me with that practiced, self-assured smile, the arrogance of someone who assumes victory before the battle has begun. But he could not know that the tide had already shifted. I carried no anger, no dramatic flair, only quiet certainty, meticulous evidence, and the unshakable knowledge of what had been done behind my back. I set a folder on the table, deliberately aligned and labeled, and spoke softly, deliberately, almost conversationally. Jeremy, I thought it was time we reviewed a few things together. My voice carried calm authority, each word measured, precise. He blinked, a flash of surprise, then smiled again, trying to mask unease with humor. I ignored the smirk, letting it hang awkwardly in the air while I opened the folder. Inside were photographs, scanned documents, annotated emails, and bank statements, each carefully selected, each indisputable, each a thread in the web of deception he had so arrogantly woven. I laid them out methodically, one by one, watching his reactions. The subtle tightening of his jaw, the brief flicker of hesitation in his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift of his posture, confirmation after confirmation that he knew finally that the quiet observer he had underestimated was fully awake. I spoke softly, almost gently, guiding him through the evidence. Here, these signatures, these transfers, the accounts you set up without my knowledge. Everything is documented. Every step you took has been recorded and verified. My calm voice contrasted with the growing tension, the subtle realization in Jeremy's expression that his careful plan was unraveling under the weight of meticulous, patient observation. He tried to laugh it off, tried to brush it aside with casual words, but the evidence was undeniable. Each item was self-contained, verified, corroborated by independent advisors, and impossible to dismiss. I maintained my composure, my voice even, my gaze steady. I did not need to shout or rage. The quiet authority of truth was far more powerful than any outburst. As I continued, I watched the transformation in him, the arrogance fading, replaced with a fleeting panic, a desperate search for an excuse, a justification, a path to salvage pride. None existed. I had anticipated every maneuver, every line of deception, and every subtle attempt at misdirection. He had played with confidence, assuming my age and composure would be weakness, but what he had underestimated was decades of life, observation, and patience distilled into quiet, undeniable power. Rachel, who had been waiting just out of sight, entered calmly at the moment I had planned, a silent reinforcement of the reality that Jeremy was no longer operating in shadows. Her presence was a subtle but tangible reminder that I had allies, support, and verification that went beyond emotion or assumption. The carefully orchestrated plan had positioned me to assert authority, expose truth, and ensure that deception could no longer hide in the corners of the house or the folds of legal documents. I guided Jeremy through each point of evidence, maintaining calm, measured tone, allowing the weight of truth to press gently but firmly against his defenses. The subtle crescendo of realization, the dawning awareness that his manipulations, arrogance, and deceit were fully visible and documented, created a tension that no words could have achieved. He was cornered, not by shouting, not by drama, but by the inevitability of truth, patience, and meticulous observation. Lily watched from the doorway, her small presence grounding the moment in humanity. She did not need the details, she only needed to see that truth, patience, and dignity could overcome betrayal. Rachel offered subtle guidance, reinforcing my calm authority. Together we created a tableau of quiet, unshakable power that left Jeremy exposed not just financially, but morally, emotionally, and intellectually. By the time the confrontation drew to its peak, Jeremy had begun to crumble, subtly, quietly, without the theatrics of anger or tears. He had no words, only a recognition that his overconfidence had blinded him. Every plan he had meticulously built, every casual deception, every smug assumption, that arrogance had been his undoing. I spoke softly, deliberately, summarizing the evidence, the manipulations, and the legal implications. I did not threaten, I informed. I did not scold, I revealed. The final moment was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. I closed the folder, set it neatly in front of him, and looked him in the eye. Everything you've done, Jeremy, it's all here. And now you will have to account for it. Not with anger, not with deception, but with honesty. It is time to face the truth. My calm, steady gaze left no room for deflection. The room was quiet, save for the distant ticking of the clock, marking the inevitability of his reckoning. Jeremy slumped slightly, the weight of exposure settling over him. He realized finally that arrogance, deception, and manipulation cannot survive careful observation, patience, and deliberate action. I did not gloat, I did not mock. I allowed the quiet authority of truth to speak for itself. He had believed himself untouchable. He had been thoroughly, quietly, and irrevocably proven wrong. That evening, after Jeremy had retreated to his room, the tension in the house softened into a gentle, resolute calm. I sat with Lily in the garden, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the air filled with the faint scent of autumn leaves and damp earth. Rachel quietly reviewed final documents, ensuring that every detail was secure, every thread of evidence accounted for. The storm had been met not with fury but with patience, strategy, and quiet moral authority. I whispered to Lily softly as she rested against my shoulder, "Strength is quiet, but it is unstoppable. And truth, when wielded with patience, cannot be denied." She smiled, understanding more than words could convey, and I realized that this moment was not only about reclaiming control but about teaching her, and anyone who might learn from our story, that dignity, patience, and deliberate action are far more powerful than anger or force. The house felt lighter the next morning, as if the tension that had lingered for months had finally lifted. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, brushing softly across the wooden floors and warming the familiar corners of the rooms that had once felt claustrophobic with betrayal. I moved slowly, deliberately, savoring the quiet, the clarity, and the sense of restored order. For the first time in months, the air felt free, unburdened, almost gentle, as though it too had witnessed the storm and exhaled in relief. Jeremy had retreated, silent and subdued, aware that the subtle, patient authority I wielded could not be challenged or undermined. There was no need for overt conflict. The quiet weight of truth, the meticulous documentation, and the deliberate steps I had taken spoke louder than any raised voice ever could. I had reclaimed not just my estate but my dignity, my presence, and my voice. In the absence of chaos, I felt a profound sense of peace. Lily bounded into the kitchen, her small energy a reminder of life's enduring joy. She looked up at me with those wide, curious eyes and asked about the world outside, about flowers and animals, about stories and colors. I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and realized that my fight had never been just about money or authority. It had been about creating a safe, nurturing environment, a world where honesty, patience, and integrity could flourish. Rachel, ever my quiet ally, sat nearby, reviewing the final documents one last time. Her calm presence reinforced the victory I had quietly achieved. Together we had orchestrated not a battle but a reclamation of truth, integrity, and moral authority. It had been subtle, slow, and deliberate, yet undeniably effective. We did not celebrate loudly. The victory was internal, profound, and enduring. I spent the afternoon walking through the garden, the damp earth beneath my feet grounding me in reality. The colors of the leaves, the soft rustle of wind through the branches, the faint hum of distant birdsong, all reminded me of the simple joys that persist beyond betrayal, beyond deception, beyond human flaws. I realized that strength is not loud. It is quiet, deliberate, and often invisible. It is the patience to observe, the courage to wait, and the wisdom to act when the time is right. As the day waned, I allowed myself reflection on the journey from shock to empowerment. The betrayal, though painful, had revealed not weakness but resilience. It had shown me the value of patience, of careful observation, and of deliberate action. It had reminded me that age is not vulnerability. It is experience distilled into clarity and quiet authority. I had learned that true power does not rely on volume, fury, or intimidation. It relies on understanding, moral clarity, and the patient application of truth. Jeremy remained a silent presence, aware of the balance that had shifted irrevocably. I no longer felt fear, nor bitterness, nor the need for dramatic retribution. The exposure of truth, the careful documentation, and the strategic execution of justice had accomplished what anger never could. In the quiet of the evening, I felt a profound sense of closure. The house was safe, the deception revealed, and the integrity of our lives restored. I sat with Lily by the fire, a soft blanket draped over both of us, and whispered stories of resilience and patience, of quiet victories and the enduring power of observation. She listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions, often offering insights of her own that reminded me that even the youngest among us can understand the value of strength tempered by kindness. Her presence reinforced the moral of my journey, that courage, patience, and integrity are legacies worth passing down. Rachel joined us, placing a cup of tea beside me, and we shared a quiet smile, an acknowledgement of a partnership forged in discretion, loyalty, and strategic intelligence. Together we had navigated deception without surrendering to fury, reclaiming not just control but dignity, respect, and a sense of moral clarity that could not be shaken. The bonds of trust, quietly reinforced over weeks of careful planning, remained unbroken, a testament to the strength found in deliberate, measured action. As night settled over the house, I stood by the window and watched the stars emerge in the clear sky, one by one, each a distant light illuminating the darkness. I thought of the lessons learned, the patience cultivated, and the quiet victories that had transformed fear and betrayal into clarity and strength. I understood that life's storms are inevitable, but they can be navigated with grace, dignity, and deliberate strategy. I whispered softly to myself, "Truth is patient and patience is powerful. Strength is quiet but it endures." Lily, now asleep, stirred slightly and I brushed her hair back gently. Her small, peaceful presence reminded me that the future need not be shadowed by past deceit. She would inherit the lessons of resilience, moral clarity, and quiet strength, not through grand gestures, but through observation, example, and patient guidance. The house was filled with the soft hum of night, the whisper of wind through the trees, the occasional creak of settling wood, the distant call of an owl. All of it felt like a gentle affirmation of restored balance. I moved back to my chair, taking up the ledger one final time, and reviewed the carefully compiled evidence once more. Not with the intention to confront, but to remind myself of the meticulous journey from shock to clarity, from betrayal to empowerment. Each document, each note, each observation had been a step toward reclaiming not only control but peace. I closed the ledger gently, feeling the weight of the months lift from my shoulders. By the time I retired for the night, the house was quiet, calm, and restored. I lay awake for a few moments, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here, the shock, the betrayal, the meticulous planning, the patient execution of strategy, and finally the restoration of balance. I understood that life would always present challenges, but the lessons of patience, observation, and moral clarity would endure. I whispered once more softly, "I am present. I am strong. I am at peace." The storm had passed, not with fury or drama, but with quiet, deliberate authority. The deception had been revealed, the integrity of my life restored, and the moral lessons preserved for the generations to come. And in that peace I finally exhaled, allowing myself to rest, knowing that strength, patience, and truth had prevailed.